Welcome back. This is Rito here with another Terraria Calamity item showcase. Today we're actually going to be doing something a little bit different because I've had a lot of people request that I do accessory showcases, and I've usually stuck with doing weapons, but I wanted to showcase some of the endgame accessories. I'll probably sprinkle them in every once in a while, but mainly kind of focus on weapons. Today I want to take a look at one of my favorite accessories, and it is called the Sponge. What I'm going to do is show you what it does, as well as the crafting recipe and some tips for acquiring it. The Sponge is available after defeating the Devourer of Gods, and it has quite the lengthy tooltip, so let's get started and see what this accessory does. So the first effect for the Sponge is a straight 10 defense bonus, which is pretty good. Then it has a 50% increase in mining speed, and you also emit light. It also does 10% increased damage reduction and increased life regen. It gives you immunity to poison, freeze, chill, frostburn, and venom. It also gives honey-like life regen with no speed penalty. And it does plus 20 max life and max mana. It has a kind of weird effect that makes bee and hornet enemies and their projectiles do 75% damage to you. There really aren't that many bees or hornets that are going to give you issues later in the game, so I'm not really sure why they kept that in the item, but it is part of the item. And then one of my favorite parts is that it does a 120% increased jump speed and a 12% increased movement speed. And one thing to remember about jump speed is that will change your flight speed vertically. It also has a boost to life and mana regen when standing still, and an increased defense and damage reduction when submerged in liquid. Once again, that's one of those effects where I don't see it being used too often because I'm usually not in liquid, but when I am, it's a nice effect. So let's take a look and see how much defense it gives us underwater. Right now we have 236 and we go up to 241. So it gives us a 5 defense boost, which is pretty good. And then it has the effect of enemies take damage when they hit you, and taking a hit will make you move very fast for a short period of time. And you emit mushroom spores and a spark explosion when you're hit. And this one right here is actually really important. The enemy attacks will have part of their damage absorbed and used to heal you. And then it also provides cold protection in death mode. So let's give that absorption ability a try. So we can kind of run into enemies here, and hopefully we can find an enemy that will do enough damage. So you can see when enemies hit us, they take a lot of damage, and it's kind of hard to see with all the effects, but we do heal a portion of the damage that we receive. I think we're healing about 5% of the damage that we take. So that combined with the 10% damage reduction is quite a bit of tankiness. You can see lots of effects when we get hit. I'm going to go ahead and kill these guys and turn off the solar eclipse. Another thing we can test is our flight speed with and without it. So let's try flying without it. And we're using our celestial tracers. And our max speed is 92 miles per hour. Now with the Sponge on, we can fly all the way to 112 miles an hour. Another thing to note about the Sponge is if you have an upgrade to the Panic Necklace, like the Rampart of Deities or the Deific Amulet, it will actually not activate the increased movement speed when you get hit. You'll have to not have the Rampart of Deities on in order to get that. So let me show you what I'm talking about right here. So we got hit and you can see we've got the Panic, which increases our movement speed, but we're still only moving 61 miles an hour. If we have the Rampart of Deities off and we get hit, you'll see that we get the shell speed boost and we can move at 64 miles an hour. So it does increase our movement speed a little bit more. And so the Sponge actually doesn't synergize with the Rampart of Deities on that part, unfortunately. In general, I prefer having more tankiness and more damage resistance and whatnot during boss fights, and that way I can always stay alive longer. I have more time to wait for potions to cool down and stuff. I find that to be a pretty effective strategy to defeat bosses, but some people like to go just full on damage, and if that's the case, the Sponge probably isn't for you, but in my opinion it is very helpful, especially when you're still new to the bosses and you're trying to learn them a little bit better. So now let's take a look at the crafting recipe for the Sponge. It's really not that difficult of a crafting recipe, but it is lengthy and it requires picking up items from all parts of the game and combining them to this kind of ultimate defense accessory. To craft the Sponge, you need to have the Draydon's Forge, Cosmolite, and Phantoplasm. So like I said earlier, you need to have defeated the Devourer of Gods. And then you'll also need the Absorber and the Ambrosial Ampoule. These two items are a bit complicated to craft, but you'll probably have most of these items required to craft them in your storage by the time you reach the Devourer of Gods. First, let's start with the Absorber. The Absorber is something that I would really highly recommend picking up before fighting the Moonlord. In the Anna the Archer series, we were actually struggling with the Moonlord a little bit, but when I crafted the Absorber, it made it so much easier, and it only requires the Ancient Manipulator, so you can do it right after defeating the Lunatic Cultist. So the items that you'll need to craft it are the Grand Gelatin, the Seashell, the Craw Carapace, the Fungal Carapace, the Giant Tortoise Shell, the Amadeus Spark, the Depth Cells, Luminil, and Tenebris. The other recipe option is a swap for the Craw Carapace, and instead it has the Giant Shell. These items are actually pretty easy to find. The Seashell is just from the rare Sea Snail in the Ocean biome. I would highly recommend using a Zerg potion to find those because they do take a while to spawn, but it's not a very rare drop once when you do find the Sea Snail, so you only have to kill a couple. And the Fungal Carapace is just a drop from one of these guys from the Mushroom biome, so it's really not that hard to get. And the Giant Shell you'll most likely already get just by playing the game, because I find these Giant Shellies all over the place underground, and it's a pretty common drop for them. And then the Giant Tortoise Shell is from the Giant Tortoise, obviously, and it's not a rare drop or anything, so you'll get that pretty commonly as well. And the Spark is from this boss from the Underground Desert, which is also pretty easy to find. And then of course Depth Cells, Luminil, and Tenebris you can get in the Abyss. However, the Grand Gelatin part of the recipe may give you a little bit of trouble. You need to get the Mana Jelly, and the Mana Jelly is easily found from Blue Jellyfish pre-hard mode, but once when you go into hard mode, you won't be able to find these guys anymore, so that was something that gave me a ton of trouble in the Anna the Archer series. And then the other two are pretty easy. You just have the Pink Jelly and the Green Jelly. You'll just need to be in hard mode killing jellyfish in the underground and the ocean, and you'll have both of those jellies pretty quickly. And the Grand Gelatin is actually an accessory I would highly recommend for some boss fights that require a lot of movement speed, like Astrum Dias and stuff, because it does a 200% increase in jump speed. I've even used the Grand Gelatin in combination with the Absorber after making a second one, because it can be very powerful. And that's the crafting recipe for the Absorber, which is one half of the crafting recipe for the Sponge. Like I said earlier, be sure to craft it up before the Moonlord because it will really help out. And it's also really good on Providence and some of the bosses early in the post-Moonlord part of the game. The Ambrosial Ampoule is actually a pretty simple recipe, but it does require a ton of different items because each of these is actually crafted from several other things. So let's just go through it really quickly. The Corrupt Flask, that's just made by combining fetid essence with a rotten chunk on an anvil. And then we have the Archaic Powder, and that is a combination of these different fossils and bone dust and stuff that you find throughout the game. So you need ancient fossils, you need the demonic bone ash, and the ancient bone dust. And you can see they're just dropped from different monsters throughout the game. Pretty simple. And then of course bones from the dungeon. And then the next part of the recipe is Radiant Ooze, which is pretty simple. It's just Murky Sludge and Purified Gel. Murky Sludge you just get from different slimes, and then the Purified Gel you get from the Slime God. And the last part of the recipe is the Honeydew, and that's from Living Dew, Bottled Honey, Beeswax, and Beeswar. All of these items you can get in the jungle. The Living Dew, I think, is probably the hardest part of the Ambrosial accessory recipe. You need to have the Maneater bulbs, the Trapper bulbs, the Murky Paste, Gypsy Powder, and Beetlejuice, all of which you can find in the jungle. This Gypsy Powder is probably the hardest one to get because you need to kill moths, and they're pretty rare. Beetlejuice you just get at the surface from the Derplings, and then these ones you just get from different mobs in the jungle. As long as you've been running through the jungle for a little bit, you'll probably have a lot of these in your storage at your base. And the last things that it requires are Stardust, which you get in the Astral Biome, and Frigid Bars. The Ambrosial Ampoule is decent since it gives you life regen and it has some other benefits, but you can also craft it pretty early in hard mode, so that also makes it a little bit better, but I would probably favor the Absorber if I have that option. But of course, once when you defeat the Devourer of Gods, you can just combine them and have all of the good effects in one accessory. So for those seeing the recipe for the Sponge for the first time, you'll probably be slightly overwhelmed, but now as you go through the game, you'll know which items to look for and be sure to keep those. And in general in the Calamity mod, anything that shows up as a material, like right here on the item, it says under equipable, it says material. Be sure to keep pretty much anything that says material because you may need it later on. And so, especially on your first playthrough, you don't want to throw away too many things or sell too many things because so many things are combined into accessories and items later on in the game. And that concludes our showcase of the amazing sponge accessory. It's definitely one I would recommend to most Calamity players. Unless you're definitely top tier and you're really good at dodging, it's going to help you out a lot. So be sure to pick it up if you haven't already. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe. I also post lots of other content like other showcase videos, and I'm working on Raiden the Rogue, which is a death mode Calamity Rogue playthrough. And so be sure to check those out if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.